Hello there guys, it's Joey. So today's video is going to be talking about a bit of a hot topic, a hot potato within the Morrigan community. Sorry, it's just, apparently I needed to visualise and feel the hot potato in order to do this video. So the video is about Morrigan and Bullets as offerings. And if you haven't heard or haven't noticed, the topic of debate, the topic of argument, it goes something along this. There was initially somebody talking about giving bullets in offering to the goddess Morrigan in her war aspect, and then there was huge arguments about this as if it was a very, very terrible wrong, and there were comments along the lines of what's next, napalm or something, and it escalated a lot. One might say it blew up. And if you haven't read Stephanie Woodfield's blog post on this, on her Dark Goddess Musings blog, then I highly recommend that you do so, because she sums up how I feel about it beautifully. But I did want to discuss it for a number of reasons, because it really ties into something which I've been talking about, which in two ways actually, which is one, this kind of fear, and I'm going to talk about that and talk about bullets as offerings and the fear aspect of that, and why fear has come into it, and how I feel about it in terms of offerings and things. And the other one is the judgment of somebody else's path, because you want to say that, you know, your path is holier, better, above somebody else's path, which I discussed in the Older Isn't Better video, and so it's all very topical for me right now. It's all kind of interlinks, intermingles, and as such I wanted to take half an hour, 40 minutes, however long it's going to be, out of my day to sit here and talk about this topic, because I'm kind of windswept. I've only just got back in. Because it is very topical, and I think it raises a couple of things which are kind of important for us to consider, not only in the scope of talking about the goddess Morrigan, but in kind of broader terms as well. So whilst this is going to be focusing on my relationship with the goddess Morrigan and how I feel about bullet casings being given an offering, and the kind of things that I think this shows and sort of throws into sharp relief, I think it can be applied on a more broad scope of spiritual paths. So firstly, I think how I feel about it is it's like much with regards to the goddess and god worship in the pagan for sense of ease as a descriptor path, which is, it really is highly individualized. It's a highly individualized path, and we all create our own paths as we walk them. We're constantly learning, evolving and growing, which is something that I covered in the Older Isn't Better video in a lot more depth. But the point is that it's so highly individual, even to the point of ritually individual, that we create our own rituals, we create our own offerings, we create our own connections and relationships and understanding with particular gods and goddesses, and in this case with the goddess Morrigan, that it depends highly on who the individual is, their experiences, perhaps their cultural background, perhaps their history, be it personal or ancestral, as to whether or not they're offering bullets. And to be honest with you, what on earth the bullet is as well, it kind of changes the scope of what it is. So if, for example, if somebody has a bullet which comes from the World War and comes from like their ancestor, that their ancestor brought to, you know, a bullet casing or whatever, presumably not live, don't harm yourselves in any way, please, and it has that sort of tie back to remembrance, to ancestry, then that's completely different to, say, just a random bullet casing that because it's a weapon, a modern weapon that you've decided. You know, it has a different vibe, and it's not saying that older is better, not at all, because we know that's not true. What I'm saying is that it has a significance to the individual which is completely different than, say, a prop. It's not something for shock value. It's not something because you think that's what the goddess would like. It's because it has a deeper spiritual significance, a deeper emotional significance to you and perhaps your ancestral line, and so on and so forth. If people are in, the military and certain things, certain bullets have played a part in their life, I don't know, some people might have had a close near-death experience and kept the bullet casing, because that sort of connects them to the fact that they nearly died, they nearly passed over, they nearly crossed the veil, and perhaps this is when Morrigan came into their lives. That has a completely different energy to it than random bullet for no reason. Now, I'm not against random bullet for no reason, and the reason being is that though I spend a lot of my time saying the goddess Morrigan is not just a war goddess, the point is it's not just a war goddess, she has a war aspect, and I think this is where the fear comes in. I think people have blown up about the idea of giving offering of a bullet because bullet is synonymous with modern warfare, and this again ties a little bit into the idea that old is fine and modern is not, because people are absolutely fine with the idea of having weapons of old on the Morrigan's altar. So having a blade, a sword, particularly when it's highly ritualized, perhaps a little bit ancient looking, in modern consciousness doesn't quite click the same way that a bullet does, and that's because it's not usual for people to go to war in modern warfare with a sword, because taking a sword to a gunfight, popular phrase, and it basically would get you killed in modern times. So it's kind of how to put it, it kind of has become less harmful in modern consciousness. It's become it's become an idealized form of warfare past that people perhaps think is easier to tie with gods and goddesses that have history from more ancient times, and people perhaps in that way perceive that it would mean more to the goddess Morrigan perhaps to have a weapon from days of yore. We're going back to things being better because they're older, and that's bump kiss again, rather than a modern weapon. And I think this ties into two ways. One is fear of warfare, and two is that people won't get their heads around the idea that goddesses and gods evolve along with humanity. So the fear of warfare means that people are more afraid of the bullet than they are of the sword, because bullets are, in modern consciousness, killers, weaponry, machines of war. And I don't know if you can really compare them in contrast to taking a bullet versus taking a sword. I think, to be honest, they're going to kill you if they're going to kill you if they hit you in the right spot. I think, arguments can be made that perhaps it's easier to avoid a blade, possibly. I don't really have experience with coming up against bullets or blades, so I can't really give you a definitive answer about that. But I think, at least in the modern consciousness, in the modern sort of way of thinking, people think of guns as being more volatile, more destructive, and perhaps less honourable. Perhaps there is an energy, an argument along that line. Like, some people feel that it's less honourable to shoot a gun from range than it is to be in hand-to-hand blade combat. Now, I mean, how you really perceive that is basically your value judgment, because, to be fair, in days of yore we had archers. Archers were firing projectiles from a distance, and a lot of the English history at a particular point, the point where England were quite dominant in Europe in warfare, is because of the crossbow. No, the longbow. Sorry, brain's not working. And English, I think the crossbow is actually the French. But the longbow and the English prowess with the longbow was a key defining moment in that period in terms of war and warfare. Now, if you're okay with perhaps, you know, having an arrowhead from back at that point in history, or an arrowhead from any point in history, to be fair, as a projectile weapon on your Morrigan altar in reverence to her warlike aspect, but you're not okay to having a bullet casing or whatever, then I think you're kind of missing the point, because they're both projectiles, they're both weapons of war, they're meant to destroy and kill and murder. And they are human inventions. Let's really take that in for a moment. All of these things that we're talking about, putting on a goddess's altar in order to honour her, are human constructions. War is a human construction. Let's think about that for a minute. And it's human beings that create these situations. Human beings create war and warfare and what that means. And because of that, our perception of what war is influencing what we think is acceptable to put on a goddess's altar, such as the goddess Morrigan, who has a warlike aspect, but it's not her only aspect. And I don't know if, in saying that she has many aspects and she is multifaceted, that perhaps we have drawn away from the acceptance and the embracing of the fact that she is a goddess of war. And perhaps, you know, people are so afraid of the term war and the idea of working with a war goddess and what that means in terms of being a warrior in modern perception, that the fear element creeps in and sort of implodes around subjects like this, because we've tried to sanitize a little bit too much, perhaps. And I am aware of myself doing it, because I don't want anybody to sit there and say that she's just a war goddess, because she's highly complicated, highly complex, and has many, many aspects. And, you know, if I had to pick one, I would pick shapeshifter above all else, as I've said before. However, we cannot sanitize gods. We cannot sanitize any gods. And you see it perhaps, and I was talking about this in one of my other videos recently, and I talked about it with regards to the Fae and with regards to angels, where people were trying to make out they were light and fluffy and good, like all angels are little cherubs on clouds on high, flitting about, and, you know, it's all great. And, you know, Fae are granting wishes and all fluffy and whatever. When, you know, in the myth, you've got some nasty stuff going down with both angels and Fae. You know, there's some violent, aggressive, dark elements to all of that. And to be honest with you, a lot of the angels, for example, are very warlike, and that's another aspect of mythological beings, spiritual guides, however you wish to put it, in a different denomination, which has also been sanitized by humanity to try and make out that, you know, they're helpful guides and messengers, rather than accept that there is this warlike energy, this definitive non-human element to gods and mythological beings in which people work within their spiritual path. So I think the human fear of war means that we forget that goddesses, such as the goddess Morrigan, are not human. They exist outside of our full comprehension. I've talked about the fact that, you know, we see spirituality through our own lens, and that's very limited. I talked about that recently. So we are applying our sort of context of what war is to the goddess Morrigan. Did we define her as a war goddess, or was she a war goddess as well as everything else and got involved? How can we ever know? It's like chicken and the egg. Did we apply the term war to Goddess Morrigan because she was wild, because she was ferocious, and this sort of escalated over time with the patriarchal coming of Christianity, which meant that, you know, any females that were warlike and aggressive became demonized. It became a bad thing. You're supposed to be timid and good and proper little wife and everything that makes me want to vomit. And rather than, you know, look at it now, we're kind of afraid, and we sort of apply these fears to the idea of a warlike goddess and fully embracing what that means. And to the point where we even get arguments to this day that, you know, if you're not involved in warfare in a military sense or perhaps a police officer sense, then you don't fully understand the concept of war and you have no business working with the goddess Morrigan. I disagree with that as well, because I think one's personal wars are just as prominent, important and soul-defining as physical war. I think war as a term has to cover all aspects, all elements, and again, human beings defining what war is and trying to eliminate other people's personal experiences, trying to sort of belittle people's individual wars. And what war actually means, is war an incredibly negative thing in its entirety? No. Wars have been fought for freedom. Personal wars have been fought against abuse. One's personal war against an abuser is frequently what connects us in modern terminology, at least in the West, to one another and to the goddess Morrigan. That's what a lot of the sons and daughters of the Morrigan who are dedicated to the goddess Morrigan, rather than people who have a passing influence with her, passing experience with her. Those that are dedicated are quite frequently survivors of some form of abuse. And anybody who tries to say that that's not a war, that doesn't forge you into a warrior, that, you know, we're not, and I used the meme before, you know, we're not victims, we're not even survivors, we're fucking warriors, and that forges you into a warrior. It forges you into your own weapon. And I think human beings have this weird love-hate relationship with weapons. We have museums dedicated to the art of warfare, to storing and preserving weapons of the past, even the recent past. You will get, you know, modern warfare museums where you can see cannons and bullets and guns alongside information. But in our heads, I think we glamorise the more ancient past again. We glamorise the ancient sword, the ancient arrowhead, because in our minds they're somehow less damaging, less violent perhaps. And I don't think that this is something that we can really cling on to, because if you're going to have a sword, then it's the same in its defining, definitive role. It's created as a weapon of death, and that's it. As far as if you can't have one and say one's fine and not have another, and you know, lay into somebody about having a bullet on their altar. Now, in England, this is a perhaps less topical, less current event type thing, because in America, obviously, you have guns, and you have a right to own a gun, and people are very proud and defend their right to own their guns and things, and therefore have more accessibility to bullets and guns, and perhaps therefore they have more of a tie, a cultural tie to the bullet, and that might not necessarily have anything to do with warfare in its strictest sense. It may be to do with you kept the first bullet that you ever shot, and you know, you've learnt self-defense, or as I know some people go hunting with guns. I'm not getting involved in that side of argument, because that's a whole cesspool of argument that I'm just not getting involved in. I don't go hunting, so, you know, whatever. But I know some people who follow the Morrigan feel quite strongly about their hunt, and they do it in such a way that they believe is tying them to the land. They don't go out and, you know, kill for the sake of it. They hunt occasionally and use up every part of the animal, and it's ritualistic to some people. Now, I'm not getting into a value judgment on that because I refuse to, and it kind of goes against everything that I'm saying here if I pass a value judgment on the people, some people in my not immediate sphere, but like further out from that perhaps, do that. Now, there are also people who declare war on those that harm animals, full stop. And that's their own form of warfare. And I know people who have declared war on those that would hunt animals just purely for sport. And it's not humane in the slightest. And it's just, I don't like that element of it. I think that, you know, the hunting animals for sport and ripping foxes apart for enjoyment is not pleasant. So that's how I feel about it. So that's their own kind of warfare. So they might perhaps keep a blank from their first ever mission against such things. Again, tying into the idea of what a warrior means to the individual. And what your altar basically is when you're addressing the goddess Morrigan is a physical representation of your personal relationship, your spiritual relationship with the goddess Morrigan. So it's basically a physical manifestation of your devotion to the goddess Morrigan. Therefore, if the bullet has some deep spiritual significance to you, then it belongs there. If you're just putting it there because you think she might like it, you're kind of missing the point with what you should be putting on your altar anyway, I think, in my personal opinion. I mean, it can be a little bit of a confusing thing at first, and it can be a bit of trial and error with regards to what you have on your altar, and what you have on your altar will likely change. Mine has changed and condensed and grown again and condensed, and over time, as I change up what I want on there, what I feel on there. You know, I didn't have bones on there for a while, and then I got to the point where I was like, that's where my spirituality is leading me, and spiritual work in that sense, which some people really hate and really get nasty about, you know. I've had hate with regards to, oh well, if you're working with spirits and things, then you're working with evil, and how do you know who it is what you're working with, and all that nasty doubt crap that we talked about before. So ultimately the point of this little bit of the rambly section is that basically it's the person's prerogative to have what defines their relationship with the goddess Morrigan on their altar. So that's how I feel about the bullet issue, which Stephanie Woodfield pretty much sums up in her blog, like I said. The need to judge one another is rife, apparently, and needs to die a death. But there is this fear. There is definitely this fear, and this is what struck me more than anything. This kind of the place where humans put these dividers, like, oh, well, a bullet is evil because it's modern warfare or something. Whereas, excuse me, where ritualistic blades are fine. And that doesn't make huge amounts of sense to me, like I said. I guess the fear element to warfare is in some ways legitimate. I mean, we've kind of lost touch with it here because it's not an everyday matter of fact. But, you know, the Celts were defined by war because they were a warlike people, for the most part. There were more agricultural Celts, but, you know, cattle raiding and warfare between tribes was just a daily truth that they could face it on, they could face it day to day. And honour was devised from warfare, and how we see and view what warfare is has completely changed. So I think what a warrior is has changed. Is a warrior necessarily somebody who fires bullets? No, not necessarily. Not at all. For example, are policemen in the UK any less honourable than policemen in the USA? Because generally speaking, I don't think the police force in the UK carry guns, and they have stun guns and things like that and batons and stuff, but I'm pretty sure they don't have live bullets in most circumstances. Not that there isn't problems with both police forces, because I know there are problems with humanity in general, so there are going to be problems with humanity everywhere, including the police force. But it's really interesting to really sort of get into the idea of us fearing war, fearing what it is to relate to a war goddess, and trying to define it in a much sort of happier, fluffier way, like trying to sanitize it within ourselves, trying to sanitize our wilder natures, trying to make out that human beings in spiritual paths are all, sorry and all, but love and light and good and fluff, and it's just not true. It's not. Sorry, I was distracted by the two magpies that were just going at it outside the window. Human beings are complicated. They have the whole range of emotions, and no one emotion is right or wrong. It's just part of the human experience, and it's very much how we engage with each particular emotion, and how we allow each particular emotion to govern us or not. And I don't believe in suppressing any particular emotion, and I think the human fear of war and the sort of argument that has come up around bullets is very telling on how we are afraid of the warlike aspect of the goddess Morrigan. And she is ferocious, and that's not something that I think any of us should be shying away from, and shouldn't be shying away from that truth. She's not a goddess for everybody, and the reason being is because she is ferocious. She expects a higher level of commitment than many, in my understanding. She will put her followers through the rigour. She'll put them through their own sort of testing and challenging, and almost like mini wars that you have to fight and overcome and be stronger and be better and build yourself up from the fire until, and you're constantly doing that. And I think when it comes to the goddess Morrigan, issues such as this bullet show that some people are just so afraid of this fierce, aggressive element of a goddess that they're not fully engaging with what it means to really embrace the goddess Morrigan. Now, she has her more caring side, and I call her Mama Morrigan because she's my mother, that she has took care of me. She has helped me. She has shouted at me, screamed at me, got me off my arse, put me through the rigour, pulled me up by my bootstraps, and, come on. She's not sweetness and light and innocent. No, she's not. But then, to be honest, no gods are. And the idea that we can sanitize gods and spiritual beings to the point of it's all fluff, it's just human fear of embracing both sides of a path that needs lightness and darkness, if you want to term it in those terms. But I don't like those terms, because I think that you can find positive in dark, and I think you can find negative in light when you really look at it, because both exist within both. And it's human perception of what is positive and negative anyway. The human agenda, usually, rather than just trying to understand and embrace, we're trying to categorize certain things as too much and too negative and too warlike, such as in the case of bullets, whereas certain other things like a ritual blade, there's a disconnect because of modern consciousness, and oh well, that's okay. and it's a bit nuts, to be fair. So that's how I feel about Bullets' offering for the goddess Morrigan. I hope I made some sort of sense. Many blessings.